The thermometer outside Thaddeus Decker's cabin read 12 degrees below zero. Inside, huddled next to a roaring fire that consumed split logs every 20 minutes, Thaddeus shivered in 3 layers of wool and furs. 30 yards away, Gerrit Van Houten stepped outside his strange curved roof cabin, wearing only a cotton shirt, steam rising from the doorway behind him into the January darkness. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if frontier survival innovations like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just change how you think about staying warm. The blizzard that hit the Wind River Range on January 14, 1844, would kill 3 trappers and 2 homesteaders before it passed. The wind came down from the north carrying snow so thick that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Temperatures plunged to 15 below zero by nightfall, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. Men who had survived a dozen Rocky Mountain winters knew this was a killer storm. They barricaded themselves inside their cabins, stoked their fires to maximum output, and waited for it to pass. Thaddeus Decker sat 18 inches from his fireplace, feeding it split pine every few minutes. The fire roared, consuming wood at an unsustainable rate, but even with flames reaching halfway up the chimney, the cold crept through every gap in his cabin walls. Ice formed on the interior walls farthest from the fire. His water bucket had frozen solid, despite being inside. He wore every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped in a buffalo robe, and still his teeth chattered. The cabin he had built 3 years earlier using traditional methods was failing him when he needed it most. Through the howling wind, Thaddeus heard something impossible. A door opening. He moved to a small window, scraping ice from the interior surface, and peered into the storm. 30 yards away, barely visible through the blowing snow, Gerrit Van Houten stood outside his cabin, not huddled in furs, not rushing to gather firewood, standing calmly in the storm, wearing a simple cotton work shirt and wool pants, no coat, looking up at the sky as if checking the weather during a spring rain. Thaddeus watched in disbelief as Gerrit walked 15 feet from his door to where his woodpile stood, selected 3 logs with careful deliberation, and carried them back inside. The entire process took perhaps 2 minutes. Gerrit moved without urgency, without the desperate rush of a man trying to minimize exposure to killing cold. When he opened his door to return inside, Thaddeus saw warm yellow lamplight and could swear he saw steam or heat shimmer pouring out into the frigid air. The door closed. Thaddeus returned to his fire, confused and increasingly bitter. Gerrit's cabin was an abomination by frontier standards. The front looked normal enough, horizontal logs chinked with clay, a proper door, 2 windows. But from there, the structure departed from everything Thaddeus knew about cabin building. Instead of a traditional peaked roof of logs and bark, Gerrit had erected a massive, curved shell of corrugated metal that arched over the log front like an enormous barrel laid on its side. The metal extended all the way to the ground on both sides, creating a half-cylinder structure that the local trappers had mocked mercilessly when Gerrit built it the previous summer. They called it the grain bin, the root cellar. Decker's folly, though Gerrit's surname was Van Houten. Thaddeus himself had been among the most vocal critics, predicting that Gerrit would freeze to death in his metal tomb come winter. Metal conducted cold, everyone knew that. A metal roof would turn the cabin into an icebox. The curved shape was absurd, wasting materials and creating a structure that looked like it belonged storing equipment, not housing human beings. But tonight, in the middle of a storm that had Thaddeus burning through his carefully rationed firewood at an alarming rate, Gerrit Van Houten had stepped outside in a cotton shirt. And from what Thaddeus could observe, Gerrit's chimney produced only a thin trickle of smoke compared to the thick column pouring from Thaddeus's own chimney. Less smoke meant less fire. Less fire should mean less heat. Yet Gerrit was clearly comfortable enough to stand outside without a coat, in conditions that were killing men in traditional cabins across the territory. The obsession that drove Gerrit Van Houten to build his strange cabin began 2 winters earlier, in January of 1842. Garrett had spent that winter trapping beaver along the tributaries of the Wind River with his partner, Peter Claiborne. They had built a traditional cabin together in the autumn of 1841, using methods both men had learned from other trappers. The structure took them 5 days to complete. Notched logs at the corners, moss and mud chinking, a peaked roof of pine poles covered with bark and sod, one door, one small window covered with scraped hide. It was identical to dozens of other trapper cabins scattered across the Rocky Mountain territory. Peter was a methodical man, 10 years older than Garrett, originally from Pennsylvania Dutch country. He had come west in 1836 seeking fortune in furs and had survived 6 winters through a combination of caution and skill. He taught Garrett to read animal signs, to set trap lines efficiently, to process pelts without damaging the fur. The partnership worked well. By January of 1842, they had accumulated nearly 300 beaver pelts, representing a solid profit when they could transport them to market in the spring. The cold spell arrived on January 9th. Temperatures dropped steadily for 3 days, falling to levels that old-timers claimed they had not seen in 20 years. By the 4th day, it was too dangerous to check trap lines. Both men stayed inside their cabin, keeping the fire burning constantly, rationing their firewood while hoping the cold would break before their supply ran out. Garrett remembered every detail of that week with painful clarity. The fire consumed split logs faster than seemed possible. They burned through their indoor wood supply in 2 days and had to make dangerous trips outside to bring more from the woodpile. Even with the fire roaring, the temperature inside the cabin never felt truly warm. The heat radiated outward from the fireplace but seemed to disappear into the walls and ceiling. The far corners of the cabin remained brutally cold. Ice formed on the interior walls. Their water supply froze despite being kept near the fire. On the 5th night of extreme cold, Peter developed a cough. By morning, the cough had worsened, and he was running a fever. Garrett kept the fire burning hot, gave Peter their warmest blankets, and tried to bring his partner's fever down with snow compresses. But the cabin simply could not retain enough heat. The peaked roof created a large space above them where warmth rose and dissipated uselessly. Cold air seeped through gaps in the chinking that had seemed adequate during milder weather. The hide-covered window provided minimal insulation. Peter Claiborne died on January 16, 1842. The fever had weakened him, but Garrett believed the relentless cold had finished what the illness started. A man might survive a fever in a warm bed. In a cabin that could not maintain adequate temperature despite a roaring fire, survival became uncertain. Garrett buried his partner in frozen ground on a hillside above their trap line when the weather finally moderated 3 days later. Garrett finished the trapping season alone, processing the pelts they had taken and maintaining their trap lines through February and March. But his mind was no longer focused solely on beaver. Every night in the cabin, he found himself studying the structure around him with new attention. He had built this cabin. He had notched the logs, packed the chinking, constructed the roof. It had seemed adequate when they finished it in autumn. Now he understood it was a death trap in extreme conditions. He started making observations and measurements. Using a mercury thermometer he had purchased 2 years earlier for tracking weather patterns, he began recording temperatures at different locations inside the cabin. The readings confirmed what his body already knew. Near the fire, temperatures could reach 70 or 80 degrees. 10 feet away, the temperature dropped to 40. In the corners farthest from the fireplace, it sometimes fell below freezing even with a strong fire burning. The vertical temperature gradient was even more dramatic. At floor level, cold air pooled and barely moved. At chest height, the temperature was moderate. At the peak of the ceiling, 8 feet above the floor, the heat concentrated uselessly. Garrett spent evenings sketching the cabin's cross-section and trying to understand the physics of heat movement. He had limited formal education, just basic schooling in New York before his family moved west when he was 14. But he understood practical mechanics and had always been good with spatial reasoning. Heat rose. That was obvious. In a peaked roof cabin, heat rose all the way to the highest point and stayed there, far above the living space. The roof itself, constructed of wood and bark, absorbed some of that heat and conducted it to the outside air. The gaps in the chinking, invisible in mild weather, became highways for heat loss when temperature differentials increased. He examined how other trappers built their cabins and found the same patterns everywhere. Peaked roofs that created large volumes of unusable space, notched corners that settled and opened gaps over time, minimal insulation in walls and roofs, small windows that provided inadequate light, requiring fires to be kept burning even during daylight hours for visibility. Every cabin he studied seemed designed to maximize heat loss and minimize heat retention. In late March, Garrett made a decision. He would not return to this cabin next winter. He would build something different, something that addressed the fundamental problems he had identified. He did not yet know exactly what that structure would look like, but he knew the principles it needed to follow. Minimize heat loss through walls and roof. Eliminate dead air spaces where heat could rise and stagnate. Create thermal mass that could absorb and slowly release heat. Maximize the efficiency of every piece of firewood burned. When he left for Fort Laramie in April to sell his furs, he carried detailed sketches and a list of questions about building materials and construction techniques. Fort Laramie, in the spring of 1842, was a bustling center of frontier commerce. Trappers arrived with their season's take of beaver pelts. Trading companies evaluated and purchased furs. Supplies came up the Platte River Trail from Missouri, and information flowed in all directions as men who had spent isolated winters shared news and observations. Garrett sold his and Peter's pelts for a decent price, enough to finance another season with money left over for experimentation. But instead of spending his time in the fort's taverns and gambling halls, like most trappers flush with cash, Garrett walked the compound studying buildings. Fort Laramie had been established as a trading post in 1834 and had expanded considerably since then. The original structures were traditional log construction, but newer buildings incorporated different techniques and materials. Garrett paid particular attention to the warehouses and storage buildings where the trading companies kept goods protected from weather. One structure caught his attention immediately. The fort's quartermaster had erected a storage building the previous year for protecting salt pork, and other supplies that needed to stay dry and relatively temperature stable. The building had a traditional rectangular log base, but instead of a peaked roof, the builder had created a curved roof using bent wooden ribs covered with overlapping sheets of tin. The shape resembled a barrel cut lengthwise and laid on its side. Garrett asked the quartermaster about the unusual design. The man explained that he had seen similar structures used by the military in the East for temporary storage. The curved roof shed rain and snow more efficiently than peaked roofs. More importantly, the enclosed volume was smaller relative to the floor space, which helped maintain stable temperatures. Supplies stored inside stayed drier and experienced less temperature variation than in traditional buildings. Garrett spent an entire afternoon examining the structure. He measured the curve of the roof, noting how the arc created a continuous surface with no angles or joints where weather could penetrate. He observed how snow had slid off the metal surface during the winter, eliminating the weight load that could collapse traditional roofs. He noted that the interior, while not heated, felt noticeably warmer than the outside air temperature, even without a fire. The quartermaster allowed Garrett inside. The curved ceiling created an intimate space that felt sheltered, despite being large enough to store substantial cargo. More significantly, Garrett noticed something about the air circulation. When he lit a match, the smoke rose but did not concentrate at a single high point, as it would under a peaked roof. Instead, the smoke dispersed along the curve, spreading out rather than pooling. This suggested that heat would behave similarly, distributing more evenly rather than rising uselessly to an apex. Garrett asked about the metal roofing material. The quartermaster explained that corrugated tin sheets had arrived as packing material around other goods. Rather than discard them, he had realized they could serve as roofing. The corrugation added structural rigidity, allowing thinner metal to span longer distances without sagging. Garrett left Fort Laramie with his mind full of possibilities. The curved roof concept solved several problems he had identified, but it also created new challenges. A purely metal structure would be difficult to heat in winter because metal conducted heat so efficiently that warmth would transfer directly through the walls to the outside air. The fort's storage building worked well for maintaining stable temperatures in an unheated space. But Garrett needed something that could be actively heated and would retain that warmth efficiently. During the 3-week journey back to his trapping territory, Garrett worked through multiple design iterations in his sketches. He filled pages with drawings, calculations, and notes. The solution that eventually emerged combined 2 different building philosophies. The front wall and lower sides would be traditional log construction, providing thermal mass and insulation. The roof and upper structure would use the curved metal design he had seen at Fort Laramie. The hybrid approach would give him the heat retention of logs where it mattered most at human height, while using the superior weather protection and efficient volume of the curved roof above. But Garrett realized that metal roofing could serve a dual purpose if properly designed. Metal conducted heat efficiently, which was a liability for exterior walls, but potentially an asset for a roof above a heated interior. If he could control the direction of heat flow, the metal roof might actually help distribute warmth rather than simply losing it to the outside. Heat rising from the fire would strike the interior surface of the curved metal roof. Some would conduct through to the exterior, but much would reflect back down into the living space. The curve would direct that reflected heat throughout the interior rather than concentrating it at a single point. He refined the concept further. The curved roof would extend all the way to ground level on both sides, creating a complete half-cylinder. This eliminated the vulnerable junction between walls and roof where traditional cabins often developed leaks. The log front wall would be built as a flat facade across the end of the cylinder, creating an entrance wall with door and windows, while the curved metal provided protection everywhere else. The entire structure would be sunk partially below grade, using the earth itself as insulation on the sides and back. The heating system required equal thought. A traditional fireplace in the center of the space would waste heat by sending it up a chimney. Garrett sketched a different approach, a small, efficient heating stove positioned to one side with a chimney that ran along the inside of the curved roof before exiting. The chimney path would transfer heat to the metal roof, which would radiate that warmth back into the living space. A system of channels under the floor would allow heated air to circulate beneath the living surface, providing warmth from below as well as above. Garrett returned to the Wind River country in late May of 1842 with specific plans and unusual supply requirements. He needed corrugated metal sheets in quantities no trading post normally stocked. He needed iron brackets and fasteners. He needed materials for creating an underground heating system. Most mountain men returned to their territories with basic supplies like powder, lead, coffee, and salt. Garrett's requirements were so unusual that the fort's trading company initially refused to accommodate him, suggesting he was wasting money on materials that served no purpose in the wilderness. But Garrett had capital from selling his and Peter's furs, and he was willing to pay premium prices. After considerable negotiation, the trading company agreed to include his materials on their next supply shipment from the east. The wait would be substantial, perhaps 3 months before the goods arrived at Fort Laramie. Garrett would need to make a second journey to retrieve them before winter construction could begin. While waiting for his special order, Garrett explored the surrounding territory looking for alternative sources of metal. Abandoned mines dotted the region, remnants of small-scale gold and silver prospecting operations that had failed within a year or two of starting. These sites often contained debris that previous occupants had left behind when they departed. In late June, Garrett found exactly what he needed at a collapsed mine operation 40 miles south of his intended building site. The mine had operated for less than 2 years before the ore played out. The miners had constructed several buildings, including a storage shed with a metal roof. The structure had partially collapsed, but the corrugated metal sheets remained largely intact, weathered, but serviceable. Garrett spent a week carefully removing the metal panels, straightening bent sections, and preparing them for transport. He counted 28 usable sheets, each approximately 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. This was enough to roof a structure 16 feet wide and 20 feet long if he overlapped them properly. He cached the metal sheets near his intended building site, covering them with branches and stones to prevent theft or weather damage. Then he returned to his regular trapping activities, working the beaver ponds while waiting for summer to pass and his ordered supplies to arrive. In August, word reached him through traveling trappers that his supply shipment had arrived at Fort Laramie. Garrett made the 3-week journey south, collected his materials, and began the difficult process of transporting them back to his building site. The iron brackets alone weighed nearly 60 pounds. The fasteners, specialty tools, and other hardware added another 40 pounds. He made 2 trips using pack horses he purchased specifically for hauling construction materials. By early September of 1842, Garrett had assembled everything he needed: the salvaged metal sheets, the ordered iron hardware, carefully selected logs he had been cutting and preparing throughout the summer, stone collected from nearby creek beds for his foundation and heating system, clay deposits for chinking and sealing. He had spent nearly every dollar from his previous season's fur sales on materials and preparation. If the design failed, he would face winter in a compromised position with depleted resources and no proven shelter. Garrett selected his building site with the same obsessive attention he had given to materials acquisition. Most trappers built near water for convenience. Garrett chose a location on elevated ground 60 yards from the creek, positioned to receive maximum southern sun exposure while being sheltered from prevailing northern winds by a natural rock outcrop. Drainage was excellent. Sight lines extended in all directions, providing early warning of approaching wildlife or weather. The site met every criterion he had identified as important for thermal efficiency and security. He began construction in mid-September, knowing he had perhaps 8 weeks before weather made outdoor work impossible. The foundation came first, and this was where Garrett's design departed most radically from traditional practice. Standard cabins sat directly on the ground or on a few flat stones at the corners. Garrett excavated a rectangular pit 3 feet deep, 16 feet wide, and 20 feet long. Neighbors who saw this early work assumed he was building a root cellar. The excavation served multiple purposes. Sinking the structure partially below grade provided natural insulation from earth that maintained relatively constant temperature year-round. The pit also allowed Garrett to create his underground heating system, the component he believed would provide the greatest thermal advantage. He lined the bottom of the excavation with flat creek stones, creating a level surface. Then he began constructing a network of channels using more stones, arranged to create pathways beneath where his floor would eventually sit. The channel system formed a grid pattern. Main channels ran lengthwise from the location where his heating stove would sit toward the far end of the structure. Secondary channels branched off at regular intervals, creating a distribution network. Garrett sealed the channels by placing flat capstones across the tops, creating enclosed passages through which heated air could flow. The entire stone network sat elevated above the excavation floor by 4 inches. allowing air circulation beneath the channels as well as through them. Over the stone channel system, Garrett laid a floor of split logs, hewn flat on top. He fitted the floor planks tightly, sealing gaps with clay mixed with sand and small gravel. The floor surface sat approximately 2 feet below the natural ground level outside the excavation. This created a step-down entry, but it also meant the living space would be surrounded by insulating earth on 3 sides, with only the front facade fully exposed to exterior temperature variations. He constructed the front wall next, using the same careful log selection and fitting he had employed throughout his preparation. Each log was stripped of bark, shaped to consistent diameter, and placed with minimal gaps. He used a technique he had observed in better constructed buildings in the East, cutting shallow grooves along the length of each log. These grooves allowed chinking material to key into the wood rather than simply sitting between logs, creating a more durable seal. The front wall rose to 8 feet at its center, creating adequate headroom while minimizing the total volume that would need to be heated. With the front wall completed and the foundation prepared, Garrett faced the most challenging aspect of his design. Creating the curved framework that would support his metal roof required bending heavy wooden members into precise arcs and anchoring them securely enough to withstand wind loads and snow weight. He had no formal training in structural engineering, only his observations of the curved building at Fort Laramie and his own spatial reasoning abilities. He fabricated the ribs from green wood, selecting young pine trees approximately 6 inches in diameter with straight grain and minimal knots. Green wood could be bent more easily than seasoned timber. He cut these trees to 24-foot lengths, giving him enough material to create a full semicircular arch from ground level on one side over the top and down to ground level on the other side. Each rib required steaming to make the wood pliable enough to bend without breaking. Garrett constructed a steaming apparatus using rocks and fire to heat water in a long trough. He placed each wooden rib over the steam for several hours, rotating it regularly to ensure even heating. When the wood became pliable, he moved quickly to bend it into the desired curve using a temporary form he had constructed from staked posts arranged in a semicircular pattern. He secured each steamed rib to the form and let it dry for 3 days before removing it. The wood retained the curved shape once it cooled and dried. He built 12 ribs using this process, creating a structure where ribs would be spaced every 2 feet along the 20-foot length of his cabin. Each rib required individual attention, and the bending process occasionally failed, forcing him to start over with a new piece of wood. By late October, he had completed all 12 curved ribs and was ready to install them. Installation required temporary bracing to hold each rib in position until the structure became self-supporting. Garrett planted the base of each rib 18 inches into the ground on both sides of his excavated floor area, creating a foundation for the curved framework. He used his iron brackets to connect each rib to the top of his front log wall, creating a rigid connection between the traditional front section and the curved roof section. Cross-bracing between ribs added lateral stability and prevented the structure from racking in high winds. The framework, when completed, looked like the skeleton of an enormous barrel. Neighbors who visited during this phase openly mocked the design. Thaddeus Decker, who trapped 8 miles east of Garrett's site, coined several of the derisive names that would follow the structure. He called it the bread oven, the pig shelter, the fancy grain bin. Other trappers passing through stopped to observe and ask questions that were barely disguised criticism. Installing the corrugated metal sheets over his curved framework required precision and patience. Garrett began at the bottom edge on one side, overlapping sheets to ensure water would drain without penetrating the structure. Each sheet needed to be shaped slightly to conform to the curve of the ribs. He accomplished this by heating sections of metal over fire and carefully bending them, working gradually to avoid creating creases that would weaken the material or create gaps. the metal sheets attached to the wooden ribs using square-cut nails driven through pre-drilled holes. Garrett had learned through experimentation that driving nails directly through metal without drilling first often created splits in the corrugation that led to leaks. Drilling added time but ensured waterproof connections. He sealed each nail hole with a mixture of pine tar and clay that remained flexible enough to accommodate thermal expansion and contraction of the metal. The installation proceeded in horizontal bands, starting at ground level and working upward toward the peak. Each new band overlapped the previous one by 4 inches, creating a shingled effect that directed water downward and outward. At the apex of the curve where the metal from both sides met, Garrett created a ridge cap using a doubled layer of metal folded over the peak and sealed with additional tar compound. The entire metal skin took 3 weeks to install, working from dawn until darkness each day. By early November, the structure stood complete from the exterior. The visual impact was striking and deeply unsettling to anyone accustomed to traditional frontier architecture. The front presented a normal appearance, horizontal logs with a door and 2 windows, but the roof swept up and back in an unbroken metal curve, disappearing into the ground on both sides like something from a fever dream. The metal had weathered to a dull gray color from its time at the abandoned mine, giving the structure an industrial appearance completely at odds with the natural log front. Thaddeus Decker brought 2 other trappers to observe the completed exterior in mid-November. The 3 men stood 30 yards away, making no effort to lower their voices as they discussed what they saw. Thaddeus predicted Garrett would freeze to death within the first serious cold spell. The metal would conduct cold directly into the living space faster than any fire could compensate. The curved shape was absurd, wasting materials on a design that provided no advantages. The partially buried sides would trap moisture and rot the wooden ribs within 2 years. One of the visiting trappers suggested the structure might work as a root cellar or storage shed, but was fundamentally unsuited for human habitation. The other observed that Garrett had spent enough money on materials and labor to build 3 traditional cabins, any of which would serve better than this monstrosity. All 3 agreed that Garrett Van Houten had lost his mind, probably from spending too much time alone after Peter Claiborne's death. Garrett heard these comments and others like them throughout November as he worked on the interior. The criticism bothered him less than he expected. He had calculated the thermal properties carefully. He understood principles these men did not. They judged based on appearance and conventional wisdom. He judged based on physics and measurement. The interior work consumed November and early December as weather deteriorated and temperatures dropped. Garrett installed his heating system first, knowing he would need it operational before serious cold arrived. The stove he used was a small cast-iron model designed for heating rather than cooking, purchased from Fort Laramie during his supply run. It stood only 2 feet tall but was built with thick walls that radiated heat efficiently once warmed. He positioned the stove against the interior surface of the front log wall, slightly off-center to allow for door clearance. The chimney pipe extended upward from the stove, but instead of exiting directly through the roof, as in traditional cabins, Garrett ran it along the interior curve of the metal roof for 12 feet before turning it outward through a carefully sealed penetration. This chimney path served a crucial purpose. The hot pipe transferred heat directly to the metal roof, which then radiated that warmth back down into the living space. The underground channel system connected to the stove through a vent opening near the stove's base. As the stove heated, warm air flowed into the stone channels beneath the floor, circulating through the grid before rising through vent holes positioned at the far end of the structure. This created a convection loop that distributed heat throughout the entire floor area rather than concentrating it near the stove. The thermal mass of the stone channels absorbed heat during firing periods and released it slowly during hours when the stove burned lower. Garrett tested the system on December 1st with a small fire. He placed his thermometer at various locations and heights, recording temperatures every hour for 12 hours. The results exceeded his calculations. With a modest fire consuming perhaps one-third the wood of a traditional fireplace, the temperature 6 feet from the stove reached 62 degrees. At the far end of the structure, 20 feet from the heat source, the temperature measured 58 degrees. The floor surface registered 55 degrees throughout most of the interior, warmed by the circulating air beneath. More significantly, the vertical temperature gradient was minimal. At floor level, chest height, and near the curved ceiling, temperatures varied by less than 4 degrees. This meant heat was distributing evenly throughout the available space rather than stratifying into hot and cold zones. The curved roof was performing exactly as Garrett had theorized. Heat rising from the stove struck the metal surface and reflected back down, rather than collecting uselessly at a peak. He completed the interior with the same methodical attention he had given every other aspect. Sleeping platform built against the back curve, raised 18 inches above the floor for storage beneath, shelves mounted to the curved ribs for supplies and equipment, a small work table near the windows for tasks requiring good light. He insulated the metal walls with a layer of canvas backed by wool blankets, creating an air gap between the fabric and the metal that provided additional thermal resistance while still allowing the metal to radiate heat from the chimney pipe. The final exterior element of Garrett's design was the feature that would eventually provide the most visible proof of his cabin's superior thermal performance. Throughout his construction period, he had collected specific stones from the creek bed, selecting flat pieces of dark granite and basalt approximately 18 inches in diameter and 2 to 3 inches thick. He had gathered nearly 40 of these stones, letting them dry throughout the autumn while he completed other work. In mid-December, with the interior systems functional and tested, Garrett turned his attention to creating a pathway from his door to the area where his woodpile stood, approximately 15 feet from the cabin entrance. Instead of simply clearing snow or laying down boards as most trappers did, Garrett excavated a shallow trench 6 inches deep along the pathway route. He lined this trench with smaller stones to create drainage, then began installing his carefully selected flat stones. The pathway stones were not merely decorative. Each stone connected to a clay pipe that ran underground back to the area beneath his cabin floor where the heating channels terminated. Garrett had created these pipes during his foundation work, forming them from wet clay shaped around wooden forms, then firing them in a temporary kiln. The pipes allowed heated air from his floor channel system to flow out under the pathway stones, warming them from below. The installation was complex and time-consuming. Each stone had to be precisely positioned to align with its corresponding clay pipe. Garrett sealed the connections using his tar and clay mixture to prevent heat loss. He covered the pipes with several inches of soil for insulation, then set the stones level with the surrounding ground surface. The spaces between stones he filled with gravel for drainage and to prevent mud accumulation. When completed, the pathway looked decorative but unremarkable. Dark stones set in gravel, creating a walking surface from door to woodpile. The true function would only become apparent during winter when snow fell and accumulated everywhere except on those specific stones. The thermal mass of the stones combined with heat circulating beneath them would keep the pathway clear and dry without any active snow removal. Garrett completed the pathway installation on December 19th. Light snow had already fallen several times, but serious winter weather had not yet arrived. His cabin was finished. Every system had been tested. The interior maintained comfortable temperature with minimal fuel consumption. The curved roof had shed early snows without accumulation. The foundation showed no signs of moisture problems. He had spent nearly 4 months and almost all his available capital building something that neighbors considered absurd. Thaddeus Decker visited on December 22nd and walked around the completed structure, shaking his head. He examined the pathway stones and asked their purpose. Garrett explained the heating system briefly, describing how warm air circulated beneath the stones. Thaddeus laughed openly, suggesting Garrett had created the most elaborate and expensive walkway in the entire Rocky Mountain territory just to avoid shoveling snow. The winter of 1842 to 1843 tested Garrett's design with methodical severity. Light snows fell in late December, followed by clear cold periods, then heavier snowfall in January. Garrett maintained detailed records of exterior temperature, interior temperature, fuel consumption, and system performance. He measured and documented everything with the precision of a scientist conducting experiments. On December 28th, the first significant snowfall deposited 8 inches overnight. By morning, the surrounding landscape was uniformly white, except for Garrett's pathway stones. The stones themselves showed no snow accumulation. The heat circulating beneath them had kept their surface temperature above freezing, melting snow on contact. The visual effect was striking, a trail of dark stones leading to Garrett's door, while everything else disappeared under white cover. Interior temperatures during this period remained remarkably stable. Garrett burned approximately 6 small logs per day in his heating stove, maintaining interior temperatures between 58 and 64 degrees. For comparison, he knew from previous winters that traditional cabins required burning 15 to 20 logs daily to maintain barely adequate warmth. His fuel efficiency was approaching 4 times that of conventional construction. The curved roof performed flawlessly during snow events. The metal surface prevented snow from bonding to it. Accumulation would build to perhaps 2 inches, then slide off in sheets as the underlying metal warmed slightly from interior heat transfer. This meant Garrett never faced the roof load problems that plagued traditional cabins, where heavy snow accumulation could stress roof structures or create leaks when melting began. He discovered several unexpected benefits of his design during these early winter weeks. The curved shape created excellent acoustics, allowing him to hear approaching weather systems and wildlife with greater clarity than in traditional cabins. The even temperature distribution meant he could use any part of the interior comfortably, not just the area immediately near the fire. The metal roof reflected lamplight effectively, reducing the amount of lamp oil needed for adequate interior illumination. In early January, Garrett made his first significant design refinement. He noticed that while the heating system distributed warmth effectively, there were brief periods after adding fresh logs when the stove burned very hot and created temporary temperature spikes. He modified his air intake system to provide finer control over burn rate, allowing him to maintain more consistent heat output. This improvement further reduced fuel consumption and eliminated the uncomfortable hot-cold cycling that characterized traditional cabin heating. Thaddeus Decker visited twice during this period, ostensibly to borrow supplies, but clearly motivated by curiosity about whether Garrett's strange cabin was actually working. During the second visit in mid-January, Thaddeus stood inside for nearly an hour, examining the heating system and asking detailed questions about construction methods. His tone had shifted from open mockery to grudging interest, though he maintained that building such a structure required too much time and expense for practical consideration. The blizzard arrived on January 14, 1844, bringing the conditions that would definitively validate or condemn Garrett's design. Weather had been deteriorating for 2 days as a massive northern storm system pushed south through the Rocky Mountains. Trappers who paid attention to signs recognized this would be exceptional. Temperatures dropped steadily. The wind shifted to blow directly from the north. Cloud formation suggested heavy snow and extended duration. Garrett prepared methodically. He brought extra firewood inside, stacking it near the stove where it would dry thoroughly before burning. He filled every available container with water, knowing he might not want to venture outside for several days. He checked the seal around his door and windows, finding no gaps. He verified that his chimney draft was functioning properly. Then he settled in to wait. The storm hit with full force on the evening of January 14th. Snow began falling heavily around sunset, driven by winds that quickly reached dangerous velocity. Visibility dropped to near zero within an hour. Temperature plummeted to 15 below zero by midnight and continued falling. This was the killer storm that mountain men feared, the kind that could trap a man outside and freeze him solid in hours. Inside his curved metal cabin, Garrett maintained his fire at a modest level. 6 logs burning in the stove, replaced every 3 hours. The heating system responded beautifully. Warm air circulated through the floor channels, radiating gentle heat upward. The metal roof, heated by the extended chimney pipe, reflected warmth back down into the living space. The curved shape eliminated cold corners and dead air pockets. Interior temperature stabilized at 61 degrees and held there with minimal variation. Garrett spent the evening reading by lamplight, periodically checking his thermometers and making notes. The storm howled outside, wind screaming across the curved metal roof, but the structure remained absolutely solid. No drafts penetrated the interior, no cold spots developed. The sound of wind on metal created a distinctive drumming, but it was not unpleasant, more like rain on a tin roof than the threatening roar of wind through trees. Around midnight, Garrett heard something unusual. Shouting from outside, barely audible over the storm, he moved to his door and cracked it open. Thaddeus Decker stood 30 yards away in the blowing snow, illuminated by lamplight from his own cabin. Thaddeus was wearing every piece of clothing he owned, struggling to carry firewood from his outdoor pile to his door. The man looked desperate, moving with the jerky urgency of someone fighting serious cold. Garrett watched for a moment, then made a decision. He pulled on a wool shirt over his cotton undershirt, not bothering with a coat, and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, but it was manageable for short exposure. He walked to his own woodpile, selected 3 logs, and carried them back inside. The entire excursion took less than 2 minutes. When he glanced back toward Thaddeus's cabin before closing his door, he saw the other man standing motionless, staring at him through the storm. The blizzard continued through January 15th and into the morning of the 16th. By the time it finally cleared on the afternoon of the 16th, the storm had deposited nearly 2 feet of snow across the region. 3 trappers working territories to the north and west had frozen to death when caught away from shelter. 2 homesteading families in cabins with inadequate heating had abandoned their structures and fled to Fort Laramie, suffering severe frostbite during their journey. Thaddeus Decker had survived, but barely. He had burned through nearly all his firewood reserves, keeping his traditional cabin marginally habitable. Even with a fire consuming logs at an unsustainable rate, ice had formed on his interior walls. His water supply had frozen solid. He had spent 2 days and nights huddled within 3 feet of his fireplace, unable to sleep for more than brief periods, because letting the fire die down meant rapid temperature drops that threatened hypothermia. On the morning of January 17th, with clear skies and temperatures still well below zero, Thaddeus made the short walk to Garrett's cabin. He found Garrett outside in shirt sleeves, examining the pathway stones. Every stone was completely clear of snow, showing dark and slightly damp against the surrounding white landscape. Steam or heat shimmer was visible rising from the stone surfaces in the frigid air. Thaddeus stood silent for a long moment before speaking. He asked if he could come inside and see how Garrett's heating system worked. Garrett agreed and led him through the door. The temperature differential was immediately apparent. Thaddeus stepped from air that was perhaps 5 degrees below zero into an interior. Mama, that felt like a warm spring day. He removed his heavy fur coat within seconds, overwhelmed by the relative heat. Garrett showed him the stove, which burned with a modest fire. He explained the floor channel system, the extended chimney path, the curved roof's reflective properties. Thaddeus examined everything with the attention of a man whose confidence in conventional wisdom had been shattered. He asked about fuel consumption. Garrett showed him the woodpile, explaining he had used approximately 18 logs total during the entire 3-day storm period. Thaddeus had burned more than 60 logs during the same time and had still barely maintained survivable conditions. The mathematics were undeniable. Garrett's cabin maintained comfortable temperature, using 1/3 the fuel of traditional construction. But the real revelation came when Thaddeus produced a mercury thermometer from his coat pocket. He had brought it specifically to verify what he suspected. He placed it near Garrett's stove and waited for the reading to stabilize. 63 degrees. He moved it to the far end of the cabin 20 feet from the heat source. 59 degrees. Then Thaddeus revealed the measurements he had recorded in his own cabin during the storm's peak. At 3 feet from his roaring fireplace, the temperature had reached 52 degrees. At the far end of his cabin, only 12 feet from the fire, the temperature had measured 5 degrees. The differential was shocking. Garrett's cabin maintained nearly 60 degrees throughout its entire interior with a modest fire. Thaddeus's cabin achieved barely 50 degrees immediately next to a massive fire and dropped to freezing temperatures just 12 feet away. The pathway stones became Garrett's most visible proof of superior thermal performance. As winter progressed through February and March of 1844, the stones remained perpetually clear while snow accumulated everywhere else. The effect was particularly dramatic after fresh snowfall. The surrounding landscape would be uniformly white, untouched, and pristine, while Garrett's pathway showed as a trail of dark stones leading from his door to his woodpile like stepping stones across a frozen lake. Neighbors and passing trappers stopped regularly to observe this phenomenon. Some suspected trickery, suggesting Garrett was manually clearing the stones, but observation during and immediately after snowfall proved otherwise. Snow would fall on the stones initially, accumulating to perhaps half an inch. Then it would begin to melt from underneath as heat from the stone surface worked upward. Within an hour of snowfall ending, the stones would be completely clear and slightly damp, steam sometimes visible, rising from their surfaces in cold air. Thaddeus Decker brought other trappers to see the pathway in late February. One man placed his bare hand on a pathway stone and held it there for several seconds, confirming the stone surface was noticeably warm to touch despite air temperature being in the teens. Another dug down beside a stone to expose the clay pipe underneath, observing warm air flowing through the underground channel. The evidence was irrefutable. Garrett had created a heating system sophisticated enough to keep pathway stones snow-free through passive heat distribution. The implications extended beyond mere convenience. The clear pathway meant Garrett could access his woodpile safely in any weather without risk of slipping on ice or walking through deep snow. This seemingly minor advantage became significant during extended storms when traditional cabin dwellers faced dangerous exposure every time they needed to replenish firewood. Garrett could step outside in light clothing, walk on dry stones to his woodpile, and return inside within minutes while barely experiencing the exterior cold. But the pathway served another purpose that Garrett had anticipated during design. The stones absorbed solar heat during sunny winter days, warming significantly even when air temperature remained below freezing. This solar gain transferred through the stones to the underground pipes, adding supplemental heat to his floor channel system. On sunny days following cold nights, Garrett could reduce his stove firing by nearly half while maintaining interior comfort, using the solar-heated pathway as a passive warming system. Word of the heated pathway spread through the trapping community faster than news of the cabin's overall thermal performance. Men understood stoves and chimneys, but a system that kept stones warm enough to melt snow continuously seemed almost magical. Trappers began arriving from considerable distances to see it, some traveling 20 or 30 miles specifically to observe Garrett's cabin. Most came as skeptics, most left convinced they had witnessed something genuinely innovative. Thaddeus Decker's conversion from critic to advocate was particularly notable. By March, he was actively describing Garrett's cabin to anyone who would listen, emphasizing the fuel efficiency and comfort level. He admitted freely that he had been wrong in his initial assessment. He acknowledged that while the construction required more time and expense than traditional methods, the performance advantages were undeniable. March brought fluctuating temperatures and unpredictable weather. Cold snaps alternated with brief warming periods, creating challenging conditions where ice formed during freezes and snow turned to heavy, wet slush during thaws. Thaddeus Decker's cabin, weakened by the heavy use during January's extreme cold, began showing serious structural problems. The constant massive fires he had burned throughout the winter had dried out his chinking, creating gaps that widened with each freeze-thaw cycle. His roof, loaded repeatedly with heavy, wet snow, had developed a sag that suggested structural stress. On March 9th, Thaddeus experienced a crisis that forced him to confront the inadequacy of his shelter. A warming period during the day had melted surface snow, creating water that seeped into every crack and gap in his cabin structure. That night, temperature dropped rapidly back below freezing. The water that had penetrated his walls and roof froze, expanding and widening gaps. By morning, cold air was pouring through openings that had not existed the previous day. Thaddeus attempted repairs, packing fresh mud and moss into the gaps, but with temperatures hovering near freezing, the chinking would not set properly. Each night brought renewed freezing that undid his daytime repair work. His firewood supply, depleted by the heavy consumption during January, was running critically low. He faced a decision: abandon the cabin and travel to Fort Laramie for the remainder of winter, or attempt to survive in a structure that was deteriorating faster than he could repair it. On the evening of March 10th, with temperature dropping and wind increasing, Thaddeus's fire began consuming the last of his easily accessible firewood. He had more wood available, but it was buried under snow and ice some distance from his cabin. Retrieving it would require extended exposure to cold, while his cabin's interior temperature dropped. He made the difficult decision to seek temporary shelter with Garrett. He arrived at Garrett's door after dark, exhausted, and clearly shaken by how close he had come to serious danger. Garrett welcomed him without comment or judgment. Inside, Thaddeus removed his heavy outer layers and sat near Garrett's small stove, warming himself. The interior temperature was 62 degrees, maintained by a fire that looked barely adequate to Thaddeus's eyes, accustomed to massive blazes. Thaddeus stayed 3 days, while a cold snap made returning to his own cabin untenable. During that time, he observed every detail of Garrett's heating system and construction methods. He saw how the curved roof eliminated the drafts that plagued traditional peaked roofs. He experienced firsthand the even temperature distribution that made every part of the interior comfortable. He noted the fuel efficiency, watching Garrett maintain perfect comfort while burning logs at a rate that would have left Thaddeus freezing in his own cabin. The experience completed Thaddeus's conversion from skeptic to believer. When he finally returned to his own cabin on March 13th, he immediately began planning to rebuild using Garrett's principles. He spent the remainder of March and April making detailed sketches and notes, asking Garrett hundreds of questions about materials, construction techniques, and thermal management principles. Spring of 1844 brought dramatic changes to the Wind River trapping community. As weather moderated and travel became easier, word of Garrett Van Houten's unusual cabin spread throughout the region. Trappers who had survived difficult winters in traditional structures heard descriptions of a cabin that maintained comfort with minimal fuel consumption. The heated pathway became legendary, described in increasingly exaggerated terms as the story passed from person to person. Jacobus Vreeland arrived at Garrett's cabin in early April, traveling from his winter camp 60 miles north. Jake, as everyone called him, was an experienced trapper who had worked the Rocky Mountain territories for 12 years. He had heard multiple descriptions of Garrett's cabin and wanted to see it firsthand before dismissing the accounts as exaggeration. Garrett showed him the structure, explaining the curved roof concept, the floor heating channels, and the thermal mass pathway system. Jake examined everything with careful attention. He was particularly interested in the fuel efficiency calculations. Garrett showed him his detailed logs documenting wood consumption throughout the winter. The numbers were irrefutable. Garrett had burned approximately 400 logs from November through March, maintaining comfortable interior temperatures. Jake had burned nearly 1,500 logs in his traditional cabin during the same period and had still experienced cold conditions during severe weather. Jake asked permission to sketch Garrett's design and take detailed measurements. Garrett agreed freely, offering to explain the principles behind each element. Over 3 days, Jake created comprehensive documentation of the construction methods, materials used, and thermal management concepts. He was particularly fascinated by the underground heating channels and the extended chimney path that warmed the metal roof from inside. Before leaving, Jake told Garrett he intended to build a similar structure for the coming winter. He also planned to share the design with other trappers he knew who were struggling with inadequate shelter. Garrett encouraged this, emphasizing that the design worked through understood physical principles, not luck or secret techniques. Any builder willing to invest the time and materials could replicate the performance. Throughout April and May, other visitors arrived. Some came as skeptics, hoping to find flaws or trickery. Others came as students, genuinely seeking to learn better construction methods. Garrett welcomed all equally, demonstrating his systems and answering questions. He never claimed ownership of the concepts or suggested he had invented something unprecedented. He simply explained that he had applied known principles of heat transfer, thermal mass, and structural design to solve specific problems he had identified in traditional frontier construction. Thaddeus Decker became an unlikely advocate for the design. He described his own experience during the January blizzard, emphasizing the temperature differential he had measured. He showed other trappers the deteriorated condition of his traditional cabin, compared to the flawless condition of Garrett's structure after the same winter. His testimony carried particular weight because he had been the design's most vocal early critic. By June, when trappers began leaving for summer trading and resupply journeys, at least 8 men had committed to building cabins using Garrett's principles. The design was spreading through word of mouth and practical demonstration rather than formal promotion. Garrett Van Houten never promoted his cabin design as revolutionary or sought recognition for his innovation. He spent the summer of 1844 trapping beaver, processing pelts, and maintaining his structure. When autumn arrived, he prepared for winter with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all his work. The cabin performed flawlessly through its second winter, requiring no repairs or modifications beyond routine maintenance. By the spring of 1845, variations of Garrett's design had appeared throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. Not all builders achieved his level of performance. Some lacked access to corrugated metal and substituted other materials with mixed results. Others failed to understand the importance of the floor heating channels or the extended chimney path, creating structures that looked similar but performed poorly. But those who followed Garrett's principles carefully built cabins that dramatically outperformed traditional construction. The design acquired different names in different areas. Some called them warm cabins. Others referred to them as barrel roof shelters or curved metal cabins. A few trappers called them Van Houten cabins, though Garrett discouraged this terminology when he heard it. He insisted the design belonged to anyone who needed it, requiring no attribution or payment. Thaddeus Decker built his version in the summer of 1845, incorporating several refinements he had discussed with Garrett. His structure used salvaged metal from a different source and included a larger floor heating system. The cabin performed excellently through the winter of 1845 to 1846, consuming less than one-third the firewood of his previous traditional cabin while maintaining superior comfort. The broader fur trade context was shifting during these years. Beaver populations had declined from decades of intensive trapping. Fashion trends in eastern markets were moving away from beaver felt hats towards silk alternatives. The economic foundation of the mountain man era was crumbling. Many trappers began transitioning to other pursuits, some becoming guides for wagon trains heading to Oregon and California, others settling as ranchers or farmers. Garrett left the mountains in 1847, selling his claim and cabin to a younger trapper who had arrived from Pennsylvania seeking frontier adventure. He traveled west to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, where he purchased farmland and began a new life. He married Annika, a Dutch immigrant's daughter, in 1849. They raised 4 children and operated a successful farm, growing wheat and raising cattle. Garrett rarely spoke of his trapping years or the cabin he had built. To his family and neighbors in Oregon, he was simply a farmer who had spent some years in the mountains before settling down. He died in 1867 at age 53, buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone mentioned his birth year and death year, his wife and children, nothing about cabins or thermal innovations. But in the Wind River country and throughout the northern Rockies, cabins built using his principles continued sheltering people for decades. Some remained occupied into the 1880s and 90s, long after the fur trade had ended. Modern historians studying frontier architecture occasionally find remnants of these structures, curved metal roofs collapsed but still recognizable, stone channels visible beneath rotted floors. The innovation spread organically because it solved real problems. Men built warm cabins because they wanted to survive winter comfortably, not because they were following an architect's plans or honoring an inventor's memory. That practical, anonymous legacy was exactly what Garrett would have wanted.